Many years ago, I began to feel that the picture of history that we're taught in school and that is beamed at us through the media might not be right. I'm not saying that the alternative view that I've presented is right, but I think it's healthy to try to present an alternative because we have a completely monolithic grip on history by the academic establishment. And I think it's a pity because it belongs to all of us. There's no encouragement for open-minded inquiry into extraordinary possibilities. And the extraordinary possibility that I've spent a lot of the last 15 years researching is, could there have been a major forgotten episode in human history? And the map here is the map of the world as it is today, with all the recognizable contours. But if we go back to the last ice age, and particularly to the last glacial maximum, which was just 21,000 years ago, when ice sheets as much as 2 miles thick were sitting on top of Northern Europe and North America and South America, all over the world, in fact, we find that the planet looks subtly different. For example, there's no Red Sea. Sea level was 400 feet lower then, and that's why there's no Red Sea. There's also no Arabian Gulf. The coastline of India incorporates the island of Sri Lanka, and the whole Southeast Asian peninsula is vastly extended, with New Guinea joined to the north of Australia here. Likewise with the American coasts. Altogether, more than 10 million square miles of land was swallowed by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. When all that ice, all that water that was pulled up on the continental landmass in the form of ice masses went back into the ocean, we had a 400-foot rise in sea level. Very sensitive control. It unfolded over a period of about 10,000 years. However, within that 10,000-year period, there were a series of episodes of very dramatic, radical flooding, when sometimes you had as much as a 30-foot rise of sea level within a period of a couple of weeks. If you consider what a 30-foot rise in sea level in 2 weeks would do to our civilization today, wiping out every coastal city, and you ask yourself, would we be able to deal with that? I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure our civilization would survive that. The reason that there were such cataclysmic episodes of melting is illustrated here, that these huge ice masses on the continents, as the ice began to melt, it first formed into glacial lakes on top of the ice caps. Sometimes you could get 4,000 or 5,000 years of meltwater stored in one of those lakes. Finally, it would burst its boundaries and just flush out into the ocean, of course, tearing across the intervening land and causing devastation, the traces of which are still to be seen today. And this process of episodic massive sea level rises was also accompanied by an enormous amount of volcanic and seismic activity. Not surprising, really, when you consider that the weight of that ice was being lifted off the continental land masses. And I'm personally pretty sure that the global tradition of a great flood has its origins in our memory of the events that took place at the end of the last ice age. It's the only time when really there has been truly global flooding. And of course, everybody's familiar with the story of Plato. Plato is the earliest surviving specific reference to the lost continent of Atlantis. And Plato, by the way, claimed to have got the story from Solon, who in turn had got it from Egyptian priests, reading from hieroglyphs carved into the walls of their temples, recording a history going back to 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That's 9,600 BC, or 11,500 thousand years ago. And that is a period which is absolutely at the peak of the meltdown of the Ice Age. So if Plato just made this up, as everybody says, then it's amazing that he chose a date that coincides exactly with the meltdown of the Ice Age. Oh dear, there we go. It's all over the world. In India, there's a powerful flood tradition, the story of Manu and Vishnu. In southern India, there's a whole separate story which relates that southern India once extended further to the east and to the south, and that a great civilization lived there and was wiped out by a flood. And again, in those traditions which are called the Sangam traditions of southern India, you find that the date that they give us coincides with about 11,500 or 12,000 years ago in our calendar, a date that coincides with the massive flooding at the end of the Ice Age. In Greece also, the same story occurs. And forgive me, I've just finished writing a new book. I'm absolutely wiped out. It's the first novel that I've written. Everything else has been non-fiction, although my critics might not agree. And I'm just completely exhausted, and I'm at a point of becoming very cranky about these technical problems. But I'll do my best. We skipped over some other slide. The Maya have it as well. The end of the last world age was brought about by a gigantic flood, the destruction of, very reminiscent of the story of Atlantis. Let's change the slide. Moses, Noah, the flood of Noah in the Bible. Next slide, please. The biblical story, it's well accepted by scholars, has its origins in the Gilgamesh epic from Sumer, which the earliest surviving written versions of which go back close to 5,000 years, and which tells a story very similar to the story that's related in the Bible. Next slide. And if we go to the Persian Gulf, where the Gilgamesh epic comes from Sumer, Iraq, we can see what happened during the meltdown of the Ice Age. At the last glacial maximum, we have effectively a Garden of Eden in the Persian Gulf. With the combined streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates running through the middle of it, there were a series of huge fertile lakes in the middle of the Gulf, and all the way out through the Straits of Hormuz. Come down to 16,400 years ago, it hasn't changed that much. There's just a little incursion of the sea. And the radical change, in fact, occurs about 13,000 years ago when almost the whole Gulf is flooded. And this is how it looks 10,600 years ago. Just little bits of it are not flooded. So it's easy to understand how that Gilgamesh epic got written as a memory of these catastrophic events. Next slide, please. Same story in Australia. That's how it was 16,000 years ago. That's how it is today. Enormous amounts of land flooded there. Next slide. And we have Aboriginal accounts of a great flood serpent eating up the land. And my suggestion is that all of these are memories preserved in folklore, passed down from generation to generation, of this extraordinary event that shook the world at the end of the last Ice Age. Next slide. Now, it's not, I think, that surprising that our ancestors should have memorialized such catastrophic events. But the view of mainstream history is that we only had Stone Age hunter-gatherers at that time to remember these events. And therefore it's odd and curious that in ancient maps appears to be memorialized a higher level of knowledge than we would attribute to hunter-gatherers, much higher. A level of knowledge that accords with our notions of civilization. Next slide, please. If you look at maps from the 7th century through until quite late in the 13th century, they're quite pretty to look at, but you definitely wouldn't want to try to find your direction by these maps. They're really hopeless from that point of view. Actually, what we have... No, let's not change slides. What we have here, they're called TO maps because the shape is a bit like a T and an O. Actually, this is west here. This is the Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula. Here's North Africa. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Jerusalem is in the center of the world on the top of the map, top end of the map there. And the River Nile and Africa is depicted on these maps as well. Pretty but useless. Next slide. Yet, curiously, preserved in monasteries and other places were maps that were much more accurate, that are much older, and which began to be copied and recopied roughly from the end of the 13th century onwards. And the source of one group of those maps was the great geographer Ptolemy, who worked at the Library of Alexandria. His coordinates were kept and could be rebuilt again into maps, and this was what happened from 1295 AD onwards. And the Ptolemaic maps, they're not great, but they contain a surprising amount of knowledge. Next slide. Another group of maps also surfaced at exactly that period, and these are the Portolan geographic tradition. And the suggestion is that they go back to a predecessor of Ptolemy, Marinus of Tyre, that some of them were rescued from the Library of Alexandria when it was burnt, taken to Constantinople, and that the Crusaders, when they sacked Constantinople, recovered some of these maps and used them to redraw new maps. And this is why the level of knowledge of cartography, particularly latitude and longitude, in the Portolan maps is really quite stunningly good. Next slide. The Dulcet Portolano being an example of this. Again, you have a beautiful depiction of Spain, Italy. The whole of the Mediterranean is beautifully depicted. And the indications are that the original source maps were actually world maps, but the mariners at the time tore out the bits that interested them, where they were navigating, particularly the Mediterranean, and ended up with these fantastically accurate maps, mainly of the Mediterranean, but some of the Portolan maps are world maps. Famous Piri-Reis map is particularly interesting in this respect. You can see here the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa. And the east coast of South America appears to continue down much further here. Here's a map of the world at the last glacial maximum, where we find that the tip of South America is indeed joined to Antarctica. And the suggestion is that this map contains information that must have been set down originally during the last ice age. Next slide. Now, that's what Antarctica looks like today at the bottom of the world. Next slide, please. And that's what it looked like in about 1800. It wasn't there at all. And the reason it wasn't there at all was because our civilization hadn't discovered Antarctica until 1818. And that's when conscientious map makers, not working on copies of old maps, but creating new maps, that's when they started to put Antarctica back into the picture. Next slide, please. But the interesting thing is that if you go back to the 17th and the 16th and the 15th centuries, you find many maps which show Antarctica. And they show it with a really quite high degree of precision. And what all these maps have in common is that they are copies of older maps. The original source documents have not survived, but the copies have. Next slide, please. Again, here, this is Gerard Mercator, the great map maker responsible for the Mercator projection. He features Antarctica on his map in the mid-16th century, 200 years before it was discovered, 300 years. Next slide, please. And interestingly, just if you go into some of the small details of these maps, it's interesting too. I was lucky enough in my book Underworld to work with Dr. Glenn Milne at the University of Durham, his team have the leading information on the meltdown at the end of the Ice Age. He can print you out a computer simulation of any coastline anywhere in the world in the last 30,000 years, pretty much exactly how it looked. Now on this map from 1513, British Isles, Ireland, and off the coast, the west coast of Ireland, we see an island indicated, and that island was called High Brazil. And quite a number of expeditions were sent out, 16th, 15th centuries, to look for High Brazil. But they couldn't ever find it because they would have needed more than a ship. They would have needed a time machine to find High Brazil. Because the inundation studies show that an island of exactly the right size, in exactly the right place, did exist until about 12,500 years ago, when the rising sea levels swallowed it. So it's a series of amazing coincidences like this that begin to convince me that, next slide please, that we're not actually dealing with coincidence. For example, from the Ptolemaic tradition, look at this fantastic extension of Southeast Asia here. Next slide. And compare it with how Southeast Asia looks today and how it looked at the last glacial maximum. And I'm suggesting that this map rests on information that was recorded by an unknown civilization, perhaps as much as 21,000 years ago. Next slide. We find these maps all over the world. Here's the Korean peninsula as it looked 12,500 years ago, much narrower, shorter, and a curious little inlet at the top of it. And this map from China shows almost exactly the same contours, including that inlet. But those contours did not exist in 1307. You have to go back 12,400 years to find the conditions that would give us that appearance. Next slide. There's two curious little islands which crop up on a number of maps, which are very mysterious, and they're called Satanase and Antillia. And they are typically demonstrated as lying off the west coast of Europe. There's Spain for you. There's these islands, Satanase and Antillia. Now remember, this is before we'd discovered the Americas, and nobody's quite sure what's over here. Now, of course, we know that there are no such islands as these in the Atlantic Ocean. But what you have to remember is that people of those times believed that on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean lay China. That was the belief that they had, that China lay there. And that belief, for a long time, overrode common sense. I mean, Columbus himself was absolutely convinced that he'd arrived off the coast of the Indies when he discovered America. It took him some time to come to terms with the fact that he'd found somewhere else. So this notion that China lay across the Atlantic Ocean at a certain distance was very deeply ingrained. Next slide, please. Professor Robert Fuson of the University of Florida has made an absolutely compelling case that these mysterious islands, Satanase and Antillia, are in fact representations of Japan and Taiwan. But put in the Atlantic Ocean because the ignorant mariners of that time felt that's where they should be. Now, what Fuson didn't consider is when they represent Japan and Taiwan. Next slide, please. If we take the case of Taiwan, here it is today, separated from the mainland. But if you go back to 14,500 years ago, Taiwan is joined to the mainland, as indeed the government of China would like it to be today. And you see the process of separation beginning about 13,500 years ago. And by 12,400 years ago, it looks like this with a large island over here. Next slide, please. Now, there's Antillia on the Pisagano chart. There's Taiwan 12,500 years ago, and there's an overlay of the two. And I think particularly interesting is this large island shown here and here on the Pisagano chart. And the suggestion that Taiwan 12,500 years ago may have been what was mapped in that map. Next slide, please. Likewise with Japan. There's Japan as we see it today. Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, the four main islands. When we go back to the last ice age, 12,500 years ago, Hokkaido was a separate island. But Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu were all joined together into one landmass. And if you look at this inlet here on this chart from 1424 and compare it with that inlet there, likewise this inlet here with that one, I think it's a pretty good argument that this is a map of Japan during the last ice age. Next slide, please. Just a reminder of the situation at the end of the last glacial maximum. The whole east coast of China is greatly extended. Japan is joined into one landmass, and so on and so forth. Now, when I started hearing rumors of ruins underwater in this area, I felt it was important on the next stage of my research to investigate these. So my wife, Santha, and I trained as scuba divers back in 1997. And we had the privilege to spend the next 5 years almost totally underwater. we did a huge amount of diving all over the world. And we did a lot of diving in this part of the world. Next slide, please. Again, just a reminder of the situation with Taiwan. And we heard of underwater ruins that local divers were reporting here between Taiwan and China. Next slide, please. And what they had found was a gigantic wall underwater. Next slide. A wall with battlements in it and a sort of patio in front of it. Next slide. Again. Next slide, please. If you go up closer, you can see that this wall isn't some natural feature. It is made of individual blocks of stone that have been built up into a wall. Next slide. And carefully fitted together. Whatever this is, it's a man-made feature, and it certainly couldn't have been built underwater, which means it must have been built when this land was above water, and that's more than 12,000 years ago. Next slide. A bit further north from Taiwan and east, we come to Yonaguni, which is the most southwestern of all the Japanese islands. Santha and I have done hundreds of dives here along this bit of coast, and I'm just going to take you for a swim underwater along this bit of coastline. Next slide, please. Starting at the west side, you have this curious parallel wall with a track winding up between them. Next slide. Just another view of it there. A clear track and two parallel walls. Nature doesn't do that, but human beings do. Next slide, please. Here's a tunnel. I'm just going to swim through it. Next slide. It's quite a narrow tunnel between these huge blocks. Next slide, please. And when you get inside the tunnel, you can see that we're dealing with megaliths, which are piled on top of each other, creating a perspective as you go through. Next slide, please. Where what you see as you come out of the tunnel straight ahead of you are these two huge megalithic blocks side by side. Next slide, please. And that's just a view up from the bottom of the blocks up towards the surface. They're really large. They would weigh about 150 tons each. Next slide, please. Again, I'm just in there for scale. Geologists who haven't explored the site and haven't dived there have suggested that these blocks must have fallen from cliffs up above, somehow falling into position without breaking. The fact that there aren't cliffs up above that immediate point doesn't deter them from this solution, because the alternative solution, that it was put there by human beings more than 13,000 years ago, is too horrifying to contemplate. Next slide, please. It's a majestic place, a wonderful place to dive, and it has an atmosphere and an aura of a sacred place like nowhere else on Earth that I've visited, and I've visited many sacred places. Next slide, please. Backing off, you see that those two blocks are wedged in beside a promontory of rock, and I'm going to bring us round this way now. Next slide, please, where we come to the famous steps of Yonaguni. Next slide, please, which are beautifully cut out of the bedrock with lovely lines and pattern to it. Now, the view of geologists working with archaeologists to preserve the accepted view of history is that this, of course, is a totally natural phenomenon. And And it was created by, as the sea level rose, the waves smashed against this rock surface. It's actually not as crazy as it sounds. They do have a point. It smashed against this rock surface, and there were layers of rock, some of which were soft and some of which were hard, and the sea removed the soft layers and left the hard layers, which just happened to look like steps. We'll examine that hypothesis. Next slide, please. Again, just a view of that place and of the main steps that we see. Next slide. And comparison with some rock-hewn stepped structures that nobody would argue are natural. These are both from Cusco in Peru, down here. They're cut out of natural rock, and everybody accepts that they're man-made. But similar structures cut out of natural rock underwater, it's much harder to accept that because it involves changing our paradigm of history. Next slide, please. So here's a view from the other end of those steps, and the notion is that all of this was cut out by the sea. If it had been, then it would have been dumped down underneath, because we can drop down almost another 80 feet below there, and we should find all that rock rubble down below. Next slide, please. But in fact, we don't. We find a clear pathway running underneath, and all the rock rubble cleared to one side. Next slide, please. As you can see here, you can swim along this path. You're at about 110 feet underwater here. And all the rubble has been nicely laid to the side. To my mind, that is human handiwork, not the work of nature. Next slide, please. And again, it's just illustrated in this diagram. Next slide. Right at the top of the structure, we're only 15 or 20 feet from the surface here, is this curious place that we call the pool. Next slide. Where in a very small area, we have a curve and a right angle, and drainage holes. Next slide, please. And again, next slide. A little further to the east, perched on top of a large slab of natural rock, is a megalith. Next slide, please. And that megalith rests on top of a carved shelf. Next slide. This is just to orient you on weathered faces. This is, of course, an Olmec head from Mexico. And this is a huge head that is found underwater at Yonaguni. Next slide, please. The eyes, the nose, and the mouth look due south. Next slide. I'm in there for scale. There's the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and a kind of platform. In fact, the Japanese divers call it the stone stage that's in front of it. Next slide, please. You can get up into the eyes. There's actually pupils in the eye that you can grab hold of. Next slide, please. And there's something very awesome about this when you see it, particularly on an overcast day underwater. It's really quite scary. Next slide. And we can see that the head, there's the eyes, the nose, the mouth. The whole head here is actually clearly demarcated. It doesn't just run on into the bedrock as it might if it were natural. There's a clear passageway cut behind it, and also the traces, just the traces of a headdress up here. Very curious. Next slide, please. And as we pull back from the view, again, next slide, please, we find that it's set in a kind of ceremonial landscape. And again, with straight pathways, and again, there are drainage channels down the side here. Next slide, please. There are many megalithic monuments in Japan, some of which we have absolutely no knowledge where they come from or what they're about. There are some from the imperial period, which are megaliths, and which are historically recorded, but some like this, near Asuka in central Japan, it's called Masadano Iwafune, the upside-down boat stone. Nobody knows who put it there or how long it's been there. It could have been there for thousands and thousands of years. And I suggest that it probably was there for thousands of years, that it's the remnants of a very ancient megalithic culture which also made its mark on lands that were later flooded by the sea. Next slide, please. And if we look at how that particular megalith was cut, we can see that the builders made these sort of H-shaped incisions in it, and had they finished their work, they would have polished it into a smooth surface, removing these prouder areas. And next slide, please. Interestingly enough, exactly the same technique of cutting stone is found underwater at Yonaguni, in a place that we know for sure has been underwater for close to 13,000 years. A bit further north now, going up to Okinawa. Next slide, please. And just to the west of Okinawa, we have this amazing stone circle underwater at a depth of 110 feet. The stone circle is not built, it's hewn out of solid bedrock. And I did take a very skeptical German geologist there who actually did know how to dive, and he and I went diving there. And he admitted afterwards that he couldn't think of any natural process that could have created this stone circle. He wasn't prepared to go on the record and say that human beings did it, but he did go on the record and say there's no natural process that could do this. Next slide, please. So again, just for perspective, there's the central stone in the circle with the surrounding megaliths on the outside. Next slide. I like the way the inner curve of this outer megalith matches the outer curve of the inner one all the way around. It's kind of spiral. Next slide, please. And again, next slide. I'm just trying to give a sense of the scale and the nature of the site here. Next slide. I think we're going to go to India now. And remember that the island of Sri Lanka was joined to the mainland of India. Next slide, please. My wife Santha speaks Tamil as her first language, and this helped us to get to know the fishermen down there and get their trust. And they talked to us. The first time we went there together was in 1992. We built up a relationship with the local fishermen, and they started talking to us about ruins underwater. And what they said was very compelling. They talked about, they regarded the ruins as a tremendous nuisance, because they were constantly catching their nets on them, and people would have to dive down and free the nets, and people were killed doing this, and they wanted something done about it. And we said, have you told anybody about these ruins? And they said, we tell everybody, but nobody believes us. And indeed, this was the case. It was the view of the archaeological establishment in India that, of course, there couldn't be underwater ruins there. But eventually, 10 years later, in 2002, we managed to put together an expedition jointly with the Scientific Exploration Society. We got the Indian government to give us the permission, send along some archaeologists with us. Next slide, please. And we went diving. As you can see, it was a very high-tech diving expedition. And we went out where the fishermen took us. The ruins start right close to shore, where the water is only 4 or 5 meters deep, and they go all the way out for 5 or 6 kilometers, where the water reaches 30 meters, more than 100 feet in depth, close to 100 feet. Next slide, please. And immediately we found ourselves on top of obvious man-made ruins. Next slide. That's the top of a wall buried in sand. Next slide. Another wall with a standout feature on the top. Yes, please. Next slide. I've got my diving knife in the gap between 2 of the blocks there. Next slide, please. And there's no dispute at all that it's man-made, nor was there any dispute from the archaeologists who were with us at the time. Next slide, please. And again, next slide. Kind of curved wall here. However, there was a political problem. We were a foreign group, and we had made a major discovery in Indian waters. The result of this from 2002 until the Boxing Day tsunami was that no information was released on this subject by the Indian government, and no further research was allowed on the site. It was embarrassing. It needed to be found by Indian officials, not by foreigners. When the Boxing Day tsunami occurred, the whole bay in front of Mahabalipuram was emptied out for about half an hour. Everybody saw the ruins. Now they admit they're there. And they have started to do some research. But the research so far is only being done in the intertidal zone, down to about 5 meters depth. And the really interesting, juicy stuff is out in deeper water. Next slide, please. Up here, off the Gulf of Cambay, there's been some interesting discoveries with side-scan sonar. Next slide. I can't show you diving images here, but this is what the sonar shows on the bottom of the sea at a depth of about 40 meters. And local not archaeologists, but people from the National Institute of Ocean Technology in India, have annoyed the archaeological establishment by suggesting that we're looking at ruins here. Next slide, please. However, the side scan images are extremely compelling of these indeed being ruins. Next slide. And again, please. And what they've plotted appear to be two cities alongside two ancient riverbeds underwater. All that remains now is for the diving to be done. It is a difficult challenge to dive there. There's a very severe tidal flow and the Gulf is extremely polluted, but it would be possible. Next slide. Off the coast of America, if we go back to the Piri Reis map, you can see in the center of this curious non-existent island, at least non-existent today, that there seemed to be a pattern. Do you see that pattern there? Right in the middle of it. I think it's the Bimini Road that is being shown on this map. And that's another curious underwater structure which archaeologists would prefer to be natural, but which there is very compelling argument is not natural but man-made. Next slide, please. What about above water? There's lots of stuff above water that may have been wrongly allocated to the historical period. Next slide. Let's go to Giza in Egypt. But just a point here that this Piri Reis map is actually set on a very modern type of projection based on Cairo, based on Giza actually. So let's go to Giza. And we see the Great Sphinx. The question is, yes, it faces east, but how long has it been facing east? Next slide. From the air, and I'd like to say all the photographs here have been taken by my wife Santha, this one from a military helicopter. From the air, you get a sense that this is truly a megalithic site and that it's very, very, very old. And what you see in front of the Sphinx are these two large temples. Next slide, please. The Sphinx was created by cutting out its core body from the surrounding bedrock and creating this ditch around the Sphinx. And then all the rock that was removed from here was moved forward and raised up into these two huge temples, where many of the blocks weigh well in excess of 100 tons. And I won't go into it in any depth here, the water weathering argument of John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But the evidence of geology is that the Sphinx and its trench were subjected to thousands of years of very heavy rainfall. And the problem this creates for history is that such rainfall never occurred in Egypt from the time of the pharaohs onwards. It was all much older than that, during the Neolithic subpluvial. At the very least, the Sphinx must have been standing there from 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, and perhaps much older than that. Next slide, please. Which also means that these megalithic temples are older than the period that they're attributed to, because they were created at the same time as the Sphinx. Next slide. Well, this is the best place in the world to stand. On top of the Great Pyramid of Giza, really, it is like being on a flying carpet. It's the most amazing place to be, and that's the second pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafren, just behind me there. A small personal note. Please go back to that slide. We're not telepathic yet. Just one step down, I found my grandfather's graffiti. Put there in April 1916 when he was with the British forces in Egypt. And I checked it out in his diary. That date in April 1916, one line, climbed Great Pyramid today. It was, there's lots of other graffiti up there, but that one was really had a personal meaning for me. Next slide. The Great Pyramid itself, an incredible structure, 6 million tons, 13-acre footprint. Next slide, please. Perfectly aligned to true north, south, east, and west. It's just 3/60th of a single degree off true north. Incredible work of precision. Next slide. And interestingly, it's also an accurate symbolic scale model of one hemisphere of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200. If it was any other number, I'd say it was a coincidence, but 43,200 belongs to a sequence of numbers that's actually highly significant and appears in ancient myths all around the world. It works like this. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you take the base perimeter, measure it, and multiply it by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Next slide, please. Why is the number 43,200 important? Go read this book, one of the best books on ancient mysteries ever written by a professor of the history of science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Giorgio de Santillana, who looks at the recording of information about an obscure and hard-to-observe astronomical phenomenon called precession of the equinoxes in myths all around the world. Next slide. It unfolds, it's a wobble on the axis of the Earth, which changes the stellar positions at certain times of year, and it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 2,160 years will give you one full house of the zodiac. Multiples of that lead you up to 43,200. Next slide. That's just repeating the same information. We're running short of time. Next slide. Never mind that one. Next slide. It's important to be clear that what the precession does is it doesn't change the rising point of the sun on the equinox. It changes the background stars that rise behind the sun on that particular day of the year. So the Sphinx always looks due east on the spring equinox, but the constellation in which the sun is housed changes very slowly because of precession. Next slide. It runs in the opposite direction to the annual path of the sun through the zodiac, and each precessional age of 2,160 years, it goes backwards: Leo, Cancer, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, etc. Next slide, please. This is a computer simulation, an accurate one, of the skies over Giza 12,500 years ago, and this draws on the work of my colleague and co-author, Robert Bauval, whose Orion correlation is of course world famous. And what he's pointing out is that there's this curious moment as the sun strikes the horizon due east, directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. We have the constellation of Leo in the sky above the Sphinx, and the constellation of Orion with the 3 stars of Orion's belt in the same pattern as the pyramids, crossing the meridian due south, and the Milky Way seems reflected by the Nile. It's as though the whole sky has been brought down to earth and made into a diagram. Next slide, please. 72 is the heartbeat of the precessional cycle. There's that 4320 or 43,200 or multiples. Next slide, please. Again, not time to go into it. Next slide, please. The point I want to make is that 72 is the important number, and 72 degrees east of Giza, we have Angkor. Next slide. Like Giza, Angkor is a very geometrical site. This is Angkor Wat, and you can see this east-west line running through the temple, just disappearing off into the distance. Next slide. And like Giza, and like the great Sphinx of Giza, the Temple of Angkor is an equinoctial marker. It's to tell you when the equinox comes. And this is what happens if you stand on that causeway at dawn on the spring equinox. You see the sun rising slowly up the side of the tower. Next slide, please. Until it comes to rest exactly on the top of the central tower, lighting the whole place up like a fairy tale kingdom. Who could doubt that this is what that temple was intended to do? This was the purpose of it, to draw our attention to that incredible cosmic moment when sky and ground are unified. Next slide, please. 72 major temples at Angkor, and Angkor is 72 degrees of longitude exactly due east of Giza. Next slide, please. There are many devices in reliefs and in statues which show a symbolism for the precession of the equinoxes, the churning of the Milky Ocean, it's called in Indian tradition, from which is produced the elixir of immortality, curiously the same concern at Giza. Next slide, please. Just examples of this churning of the Milky Ocean. This is the serpent Vasuki. Next slide, please. Wrapped around Mount Mandara, gods on one side, demons on another. They're churning him around Mount Mandara and producing the elixir of immortality, and that's Vishnu in the middle. Next slide, please. And curiously, there's a star diagram at Angkor, a serpent diagram. The constellation of Draco appears to be mapped on the ground by the major temples in the Angkor complex. Next slide, please. And it only works perfectly on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC. If you go to the period when we know the temples were built, which was about 1100 to 1200 AD, the constellation is either upside down or below the horizon. It doesn't fit the pattern on the ground. So, but I'm not disputing the archaeological date for Angkor as 11 to 1200 AD. So what's going on here? Were they working on ancient records, or is it possible that there's an earlier layer of archaeology at Angkor? All the evidence suggests that this is indeed the case. Next slide, please. So it seems to be a kind of three-dimensional representation of the constellations at the cardinal point, like a sort of computer game, with Leo rising in the east, mirrored by the Sphinx on the ground, Aquarius setting in the west. Interesting that. What's that mirrored by? Orion crossing the meridian in the south at its lowest point. Orion goes up and down like the end of a seesaw in the pattern of the pyramids. Two of the shafts in the Great Pyramid point to stars in the northern sky that are mapped on the ground by temples at Angkor. Seems to be a pattern emerging here. Next slide, please. Interestingly, if we go back to that time, 12,500, 13,000 years ago, something really quite extraordinary did happen then. The Earth was hit by a gigantic comet. It hit North America, it fragmented, it created the Carolina Bays. It was responsible for huge extinctions all around the world. It's very odd that this should date exactly to the time that seems to come up in so many myths and traditions about the loss of an ancient civilization. Next slide, please. So, could it be even further? Could a deliberate connection be being made through this universal language of astronomy and long-lasting, enduring megalithic architecture, speaking from that time to this time? Because what we find is that today, Orion is at its highest point in its cycle, Draco's at its lowest point, and Leo is setting beneath the horizon, and Aquarius is rising as we enter the age of Aquarius. It's like the whole diagram has come halfway around the circle. Next slide, please. That time, a time of cataclysm, 12,500 years ago, is there a message here to our time? Certainly the Mayan calendar is taken by some to suggest a prophecy of the end of the world, or at least of civilization as we know it, on the 21st of December, 2012. Next slide, please. The previous world age in the Mayan system was ended by a cataclysm. Next slide. And the Dresden Codex has this image of the destruction of the world, the rain serpents stretching across the sky, the final, all-embracing cataclysm, a cataclysm of water that is to come upon us. Next slide, please. The Mayan calendar is full of those same system of numbers that we find at Giza, 72 working its way up. Go ahead, next slide. And they also made pyramidal structures aligned to the sun at certain times of the year. Next slide. This pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza is also an equinoctial marker, because only on the equinox do you get the serpent effect on the northern stairway. It's so set that around 5 in the evening, as the sun is setting, the whole form of the serpent, the head of the serpent is always at the bottom, but in shadow play, the whole form of the serpent appears. Next slide. And it forewarns of an event 2 months later, when the sun and the Pleiades conjunct at the zenith of the sky. So there's no doubt, not only that this is an equinoctial marker, but also it's pointing to our current era, because this is the only time that this highly significant conjunction occurs. Next slide, please. And it raises to my mind, could it be something to do with this comet that hit the Earth 12,900 years ago? Could it be something that's going to come back? Is it possible that these monuments were encoding a warning that half a precessional cycle onwards from the last comet impact, that we might be about to face another? Next slide, please. Long period comets have very long, very narrow elliptical orbits. Perhaps we're dealing with a long period comet with an orbit of 12,500 years. Next slide. And we know what comets did to, what Shoemaker-Levy did when it broke into different fragments and hit Jupiter. Thank goodness for Jupiter. We should all be grateful for Jupiter, because none of us would be here if Jupiter wasn't there, sweeping up all those malicious comets flying in from the Oort cloud. But it doesn't sweep them all up, not all of them. Some of them get through to the inner solar system. Next slide, please. That would be one suggestion. If I try to take the Mayan calendar seriously as a prediction of apocalypse, could they were star watchers, could they be predicting the return of a fragmented comet? Some of the fragments hit us 12,500 years ago, the rest are due pretty soon. I hope not. I hope that the other view is right, because the other view is that the Mayan calendar is suggesting a kind of rebirth of humanity, that we're going to emerge from this mess that we've got ourselves into and come through to something better. Next slide, please. And this notion, again, derives from precession, and we see the sun moving steadily towards the center of our galaxy on the winter solstice. And it's the cosmic rebirth of the sun from the womb of the galaxy that may be indicated by this end date of 2012. Next slide. And again, please. Yeah, just go back again. I just wanted to mention John Major Jenkins, whose image I showed earlier, and his point that what the Maya really believed is that the years around 212 would be attended by great changes, and in accordance with their world age creation mythology, the transformation of human beings into something completely new. Next slide, please. And the same idea occurs in ancient Egypt as well, in the Hermetic texts. Now, these were texts that were written in Greek and Latin at the end of the ancient Egyptian period. It was as though they were seeking to transfer ancient Egyptian ideas into the more modern idiom. And I'm just going to finish with a reading of a prophecy. We call it the Lament, that is contained in the Asclepius, one of these Hermetic texts. And it's a dialogue between the god Thoth, Hermes, and Asclepius, his pupil. So Thoth, Hermes, is saying to Asclepius this: "Do you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven are present in the earth below. In fact, it should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in this our land as in a sanctuary." I would suggest here that by the way, I'm finishing after this, so I won't keep you much longer. I would suggest here that when they speak of Egypt, they're speaking of the whole world, not simply of Egypt. And yet, since it is fitting that wise men should have knowledge of all events before they come to pass, you must not be left in ignorance of what I will now tell you. There will come a time when it will have been in vain that Egyptians have honored the Godhead with heartfelt piety and service, and all our holy worship will be fruitless and ineffectual. The gods will return from earth to heaven. Egypt will be forsaken, and the land which was once the home of religion will be left desolate, bereft of the presence of its deities. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. That reminds me of the day we live in now, our time. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare. This combination and accumulation of all the manifold things that call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, the impious wise, the madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. Sounds very like the 21st century to me. As for the soul and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may hope to attain to immortality as I have taught you, all this they will mock and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All voices of the gods will be forced into silence. The fruits of the earth will rot. The soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass, and will stop the disorder by the counterforce of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous songs of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.